There was a city that never truly slept. Los Angeles in the summer of 1985 moved through its nights with the particular confidence of a place that believed it understood its own dangers. People locked their doors. People watched their neighborhoods. People thought they knew what threat looked like. They were wrong. Because the thing moving through those neighborhoods in the dark did not announce itself. It did not fit the shape of what people imagined danger to be. It walked through unlocked windows. It stepped through open doors. It arrived without warning and left behind something that no community could easily name. Not just grief, not just fear, but a specific kind of psychological rupture. The realization that the ordinary surface of a city could contain something deeply, quietly, catastrophically wrong. His name was Richard Ramirez. And before the newspapers gave him a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. Before the courtrooms and the cameras and the crowds of young women who pressed their faces against the glass to look at him. Before any of that, he was just a boy growing up in a border city in Texas, learning things that no child should ever have to learn, in ways that would leave marks that never healed. This is not a story about how he was caught. This is not a story about police procedure or forensic evidence or the mechanics of investigation. This is a story about a human being and the long, disturbing process by which that human being was shaped into something the world would struggle to understand. It is a story about patterns, about what forms in silence, about what grows in the dark when no one is paying attention, or when the people paying attention have already given up. The most unsettling question Richard Ramirez leaves behind is not what he did. It is when it started, because the answer, when you look carefully, is much earlier than most people want to believe. If this kind of dark psychological storytelling is what draws you in, consider subscribing to Black Pattern. This channel exists for those who want to understand not just what happened, but why, the psychology, the patterns, the disturbing inner architecture of the criminal mind. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and if this video reaches you in some meaningful way, a like helps this kind of serious documentary work reach more people. Now let us go back to where this story actually begins. El Paso, Texas. A border city built at the intersection of cultures, economies, languages, and lives. A city of enormous heat and particular silence. The kind of place where life is lived close to the edge of many things. Economic pressure, social isolation, the friction of poverty pressing against ambition. Richard Ramirez was born there on February 29, 1960. The youngest of 5 children in the family of Julian and Mercedes Ramirez. His father was a man who worked hard and who carried within him the particular exhaustion of someone always fighting for ground that kept shifting beneath his feet. Julian Ramirez was, by multiple accounts, a man prone to frustration that expressed itself physically, toward his children, toward the environment around him. The household was not a peaceful one. It was a household where tension was a permanent resident, where the emotional atmosphere carried a weight that children absorb without understanding what they are absorbing. Richard, from early accounts, was a sensitive child in the particular way that sensitivity in difficult environments tends to develop. Not softly, but internally. He learned to move inward. He learned to contain. He learned that the external world was not reliably safe, and so he began constructing an internal one. This is not unusual. Many children raised in chaotic or violent environments develop precisely this capacity for internal retreat. The critical question is always what that internal world is furnished with. What images? What feelings? What ideas begin to take root in the private space a child creates when the external world fails them? For Richard Ramirez, the furnishing of that internal world would be profoundly shaped by a figure who entered his life during his formative years, and who, according to investigators, biographers, and those who later studied his psychological history closely, may have been the most catastrophically damaging influence in the story of who he became. His cousin, Miguel Ramirez, known as Mike, was a Vietnam War veteran. He returned from that war carrying things that war returns to some men: violence absorbed into the nervous system, a disconnection from ordinary moral boundaries, and in Mike's case, something more specific and more disturbing. Mike Ramirez had photographs. He showed them to the young Richard. They were photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have sexually assaulted and killed during the war. He spoke of these experiences not with shame, but with something closer to pride, with the casual fluency of someone describing ordinary events. Richard Ramirez was, at the time, a child. He was not simply exposed to graphic content. He was being educated, in the particular way that a trusted male figure educates a young boy who looks up to him, in a specific emotional and moral orientation toward violence, toward women, toward power. He was being taught that cruelty was a form of control, that control was a form of identity, and that the suffering of others could be experienced as something desirable. Investigators and biographers have repeatedly pointed to this relationship as central. It is impossible to quantify precisely what it did to the developing architecture of Richard Ramirez's psychology, but the pattern it established, the association between violence and sexual power, between dominance and identity, appears in every phase of his later life, expressed with escalating clarity. There is something else about this period that matters deeply. In 1973, when Richard was 13 years old, he witnessed something no child should witness. He was present when Mike Ramirez shot and killed his own wife during an argument. Richard was in the room. He watched it happen. He watched a woman's life end because a man with a weapon decided it should. And according to those who later examined the psychological record, this experience did not horrify him in the way one might hope. It fascinated him. This is not a comfortable thing to say about a 13-year-old boy. It is important to say it carefully. The fascination was not a choice in the simple sense. It was the response of a mind that had already been shaped by Mike's influence, a mind that had already begun associating violence with power in ways that were becoming embedded. Witnessing the act did not create a revulsion that might have redirected the trajectory. It deepened it. Shortly after this event, Richard began spending significant time at a local park, smoking marijuana, drifting away from school, away from family structure, away from the ordinary social scaffolding that might have provided a different kind of influence. He was entering adolescence not as a connected young person moving toward community and identity, but as someone already profoundly isolated, already carrying a private world that he shared with no one. At school, those who knew him remembered him as unremarkable in the particular way that children in pain often appear unremarkable: quiet, withdrawn, present in body, but absent in engagement. He was not a child who acted out dramatically in public. He did not display the visible aggression that would prompt intervention. He was, in many ways, invisible to the systems around him. And invisible children in pain are the ones the systems most catastrophically fail. There were early signs that pointed somewhere concerning, but they were the kind of signs that, individually, could be explained away. Truancy could be laziness. Marijuana use could be teenage experimentation. Withdrawal could be introversion. Petty theft, which began appearing in his adolescent record, could be poverty and opportunity. Each sign, taken alone, could be rationalized. Taken together, they formed something that should have been visible: a young person in serious psychological distress, moving through life without attachment, without empathy, without a stable moral framework, and with a set of internal associations that were becoming more dangerous with each year. By the time he was in his mid-teens, Richard Ramirez had essentially separated himself from the expectations of conventional life. He was not in school in any meaningful sense. He was not embedded in a social network of peers who oriented toward ordinary futures. He was drifting, physically, emotionally, psychologically, through the landscape of El Paso and eventually beyond it, moving toward the California that would become the geography of what he carried inside him. California, and specifically Los Angeles, was a city that absorbed young men with nothing and asked few questions. It was a city of surfaces, of reinvention, of the promise that you could arrive and become something new. For Richard Ramirez, arriving in Los Angeles in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the city offered something different than reinvention. It offered anonymity. It offered the particular freedom that invisibility provides to someone with a private world they have been building and protecting for years. He lived without stability. He moved between motels, between borrowed spaces, between the margins of places where people do not look at each other too carefully. He was, during this period, not someone who appeared threatening to those who encountered him casually. He was thin, quiet, often distant. He had a quality that some people who later remembered him described as unremarkable, even harmless seeming. which is, of course, exactly the quality that the most functionally dangerous people tend to possess. He was developing a drug dependency during these years that would shape the rhythm of his behavior. Cocaine, primarily, which in its particular way distorts the internal world, amplifying whatever is already present, removing whatever small inhibitions might otherwise provide friction. For someone whose internal world contained what Richard Ramirez's contained, the amplification of cocaine was not a recreational shift. It was an acceleration. He was also, during these years, beginning to steal. Not petty theft as adolescent experimentation, but theft as occupation, as a way of moving through the world. He moved through neighborhoods at night. He learned how to be invisible in the dark. He learned the particular geography of houses, where entrances were, where lights left spaces unguarded, where people's habits created vulnerability. He was learning, systematically and by experience, the geography of other people's private spaces, and he was becoming more comfortable there than anywhere else. This is a critical phase in understanding what came next. The escalation from property crime to violent crime is not always a sudden rupture. In Richard Ramirez's case, as in many cases that investigators and behavioral analysts have studied, there appears to have been a long period of immersion in other people's private spaces, entering homes while people slept, moving through the intimate geography of strangers' lives without their knowledge. This period was doing something psychologically. It was rehearsing a relationship between himself and the people in those spaces, a relationship defined entirely by his invisibility, his control, and their unawareness. At some point in this trajectory, awareness of the other person in the space ceased to feel like a complication and began to feel like something else. Something that connected to what Mike had taught him. Something that connected to the photographs, to the language of power, to the internal architecture that had been building since childhood. The first documented murder attributed to Richard Ramirez occurred in 1984. The victim was a 9-year-old girl. What happened to her was an expression of the deepest distortions in whatever had formed inside him. Violence and sexual aggression directed at its most devastatingly innocent target. It is important to name what it reveals, not in graphic detail, but in psychological clarity. By this point, the boundaries that separate human beings from each other, the basic recognition of the other person as a person, had collapsed entirely in the interior world of Richard Ramirez. This collapse does not happen suddenly. It forms over years. The exposure to violence as power, the witness of death as a demonstration of control, the isolation from human connection, the drift through other people's private spaces as an invisible presence, the numbing effects of sustained drug use, the fantasies that grew in the absence of any competing emotional reality. All of it accumulated, layer by layer, into a consciousness that had reorganized itself around something that had no place for the humanity of others. What followed in 1985 is documented in the public record and in the collective memory of Los Angeles and the surrounding communities as one of the most terrifying crime sequences in California history. Between the spring and summer of that year, Ramirez attacked homes across the Los Angeles area and later in San Francisco, entering through unlocked windows and doors, targeting men and women of varying ages, committing murders and sexual assaults with what investigators described as a disturbing lack of consistent pattern in victim selection, which was itself part of what made him so difficult to anticipate. The lack of pattern in victim selection deserves psychological attention. He was not choosing victims based on a specific profile in the way some serial offenders do. He was choosing based on opportunity and vulnerability. This reflects something important about the nature of what had formed inside him. It was not organized around a specific type of person or a specific fantasy with precise parameters. It was organized around control itself, around the experience of total power in a private space over whoever was present. The victim's identity was almost secondary to the fact of the domination. This is one of the most disturbing qualities a criminal psychology can possess, because it means that the threat is genuinely diffuse. There is no profile to avoid. There is no set of behaviors that guarantees safety. It means that the danger exists everywhere and nowhere, that it could arrive at any window on any street. The fear that spread through Los Angeles during those months was not simply fear of a specific person. It was the older and more primal fear of the unknown presence, of something that could enter the protected space of home and private life and destroy it without warning. People installed locks. People slept less. People looked at their neighbors differently. The city was experiencing something that fear of this nature always produces, a fracturing of the ordinary trust that makes communal life possible. Ramirez was, during this period, living in the particular contradiction that defines many of the most serious criminal cases. A public face that remained, to those who encountered it casually, unassuming and unremarkable, and a private reality that was catastrophically violent. He moved through the city's ordinary spaces, convenience stores, hotels, public transit, as a presence that did not announce itself. He was thin, he was quiet. He had bad teeth and wore dark clothes and looked to most people who glanced at him like simply another person drifting through the city's margins. This is the part of the story that always demands the most psychological attention, and that is most consistently misunderstood. The question people want to ask is, how did no one see it? The answer is that the seeing and not seeing of danger is not simply a failure of observation. It is a function of what danger is taught to look like and what we have been culturally prepared to recognize. A figure who is loud, aggressive, obviously unstable. This is legible as threat. A figure who is quiet, who drifts, who maintains a surface of ordinariness, even while carrying something catastrophic beneath it. This is far harder to read. And it is the harder to read figures who represent the most profound failures of the systems designed to protect people. There is also something worth noting about Ramirez's relationship to identity during this period. He had, according to various accounts and what emerged in later investigations and psychological discussions, an interest in satanic imagery and symbolism that was not simply aesthetic. It appeared to function as a framework, a way of organizing and giving meaning to what he was doing, of locating himself within a narrative that made his acts feel, within his own internal logic, like something other than simple destruction. He drew pentagrams. He referenced Satan in ways that were partly performative and partly, it seems, genuinely believed. This is not unusual in the psychology of serious criminal offenders, and it is important not to misread it. The adoption of an ideological or symbolic framework around violence is rarely the cause of the violence. It is a way of managing the internal experience of it, of constructing a story that makes the perpetrator feel less like someone who has simply lost all human connection and more like someone who is enacting something meaningful. The framework comes after the psychology. The psychology is what matters. What the satanic imagery reveals, stripped of its surface, is a profound need to locate the violence within a framework of power and meaning, to make it feel intentional, chosen, significant. This is the desperate cognitive work of a person who has, at the deepest level, no other source of identity or significance. When a person has no stable sense of self built from connection, from achievement, from mutual recognition, from love, when all of that has either never been present or has been destroyed, then the only available source of felt significance becomes the one thing that makes them feel most purely in control. By August of 1985, the investigation had begun to close in, though not through any single dramatic moment. A partial license plate, fingerprints, a composite sketch that circulated widely enough that something remarkable happened, which was that Ramirez was recognized not by police but by ordinary members of the public in a neighborhood in East Los Angeles. He was recognized, he was chased, and he was captured not by the institutional apparatus of law enforcement, but by the people of a community who had been living in fear and who, in that moment, acted. His trial, which took place years later, the delays caused partly by legal complexity and partly by events within the proceedings themselves, became a strange theater of the kind that serious criminal trials sometimes produce. Young women gathered outside. They sent him letters. They were drawn to him in ways that are themselves worth psychological attention, not because of anything admirable in the figure they were drawn to, but because of what it reveals about certain cultural confusions around danger, around transgression, around the performance of darkness as a form of identity. Ramirez in the courtroom sometimes played to this. He held up his hand with a pentagram drawn on the palm. He smiled at cameras. This performance is important to name clearly. It is not evidence of power or authenticity. It is evidence of someone who, without any genuine interior life built on human connection, had learned to use the projection of threat as a substitute for identity. The performance in the courtroom was the same impulse that had driven everything before it. The need to feel significant, to feel powerful, to feel that others were oriented around him. Whether in fear or in the particular distorted fascination that some people mistake for something more complex than it is. He was convicted in 1989 on 13 counts of murder, along with numerous counts of sexual assault and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death. He died on death row in 2013, before the sentence was carried out, from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. He was 53 years old. The communities he moved through during those months in 1985 did not recover quickly from what he left behind. This is the thing that criminal psychology documentation sometimes fails to adequately address. Not the mechanics of the crimes, not the profile of the perpetrator, but the specific lasting human cost to the people who survived, the people who lost someone, the people who lived in the neighborhoods and slept less and trusted their homes less, and carried a particular kind of vigilance for years afterward. Every case of this nature leaves that residue, that alteration in the texture of ordinary life. That is not dramatic and does not make headlines, but is very real and very lasting. Richard Ramirez did not emerge from nothing. He emerged from a specific environment, specific relationships, specific exposures at specific developmental moments, specific patterns of isolation and neglect and damage that accumulated over years before anything violent happened. This is not a statement made to excuse. Nothing in his history excuses the destruction he caused. But understanding the pattern matters. It matters profoundly, because the pattern is not unique to him. The specific details are his. The pattern is something that can be recognized, that can be intervened in, that can be addressed if the people and systems around a child are paying attention and are willing to act on what they see. The child who spent hours with a man who described atrocity with pride. The child who witnessed a killing and felt something that was not horror. The adolescent who drifted away from all human connection and entered a private world that no one thought to examine. The young man who moved through other people's private spaces in the dark, rehearsing a relationship to power that was becoming more organized and more dangerous with each year. Each of these moments contained something legible if someone had been positioned to read it. Most people who are exposed to difficult childhoods, to trauma, to difficult family environments, do not become what Richard Ramirez became. This is important to state clearly. The path from damaged childhood to criminal violence is not inevitable or deterministic. But there are patterns, and the patterns have signatures, and the signatures are visible in retrospect with a clarity that demands that we ask why they were not visible in the moment, and what it would take to make them so. What the case of Richard Ramirez ultimately leaves behind, beyond the fear and the grief and the years of legal proceedings, is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. It is the question of how we understand the people among us who are quietly building something catastrophic inside themselves, who look ordinary, who drift through the margins of ordinary life, who give the world no clear signal of what is forming beneath the surface. The most frightening thing about his story is not the violence. The violence is documented. It is in the public record. It is known. The most frightening thing is the silence that preceded it, the years of invisible formation, the patterns that were there, that were readable, that were connected by a thread that ran from a child in El Paso watching his cousin's photographs to a figure moving through open windows in Los Angeles 30 years later. The pattern was always there. The world simply did not know how to look at it, and in cases like this, not knowing how to look, or choosing not to, is never truly without consequence.